What a countdown there. Chris, hello and welcome to our Work Well webinar.
Hi, Brian. I'm really excited. That was a hell of a countdown. I feel like there should have been dry ice coming out the bottom of my laptop here. That was super exciting.
It was
great to be here.
It was an emotional one. Yeah, it was a nice one. All right. How are you getting on?
I'm good, thanks. Yeah. Delighted. It's December, kind of looking forward to Christmas, looking forward to seeing family. Work is slowly quietening down, so less delivery, more research, which, if I'm to be honest, I love delivery. It's exciting, but I do love a bit of research. So yeah, enjoying life.
Fantastic. Yeah. And I believe congratulations are in order as well. I saw your post online recently. You're officially an Irish citizen.
Officially, can you believe I've been here nearly 20 years? I only got around to it about 3 years ago. But yeah, delighted. Ireland is my home, and yeah, really happy to finally be a citizen. Thanks for that.
Lovely. And what does that mean exactly to you? I mean, first of all, I know it means you're still, the dream of playing soccer for the Republic of Ireland is still alive. Is there anything else there? Is it kind of is it symbolic or what does it mean?
Primarily for me, this is my home, so it's very much a symbolic thing. Ireland definitely wouldn't want me playing any of the team sports like that. Pretty good when it comes to athletics, but the other stuff they wouldn't want me. So, but yeah. I mean, for me, it's really so that I can, just be more of a proud citizen. I've always been proud to be here, but it's just almost having the documentation to prove that.
Fantastic. Yeah, no, that's a great story. So delighted about that. So listen, we're going to talk about the right to disconnect today. We're six months into the legislation, to the code of practice. So I'm interested to get your thoughts as a real thought leader in this area. You've co-founded Unplug, a really interesting organization that supports people to, I would say to disconnect totally from technology. Certainly not. It's to manage their relationship with technology. You're big fans of technology at Unplug, but the work you do is kind of to support people to manage their relationships with technology.
Absolutely, yeah.
And for anyone tuning in, you're welcome to use the chat no matter what stream you're joining us on. We're going out on LinkedIn, we're on YouTube, we're on Facebook, we're actually on Twitter as well. We should see all the comments. We'd love your questions. We'd love any thoughts you have on where we're going in this direction. We'll allow time at the end as well. We're coming up to the festive period. We'll have a chat about maybe, switching off that a little bit over Christmas. How can we better manage our relationships with technology over the festive period? I'm sure we'll have time for that. But I think to kick off, Chris, you've got a nice presentation prepared for us. If you want, we're going to kick off with that, and then we'll take it from there. We'll take questions, and we'll have a bit of a chat afterwards.
Great, thank you, Brian. So for the lion's share of this, I'd really love to hear from you guys in relation to how you're finding things in relation to the rights disconnect, and then maybe the wider piece around digital well-being and digital culture. But I have a couple of slides to share with you up front. Just to kick off, I wanted to share a personal experience, because we've all had an interesting time, let's say, in the last 20 odd months. We've all had different challenges. This was a minor challenge I faced about 20 months ago. Me and the team at Unplug, we realized that actually we weren't going to have in real life events, so we needed to all get green screens, and we got really cheap equipment. The reason I'm saying we got cheap equipment is because, like the whole world, we thought this was going to be a very short-term thing. And this was an example I wanted to share with you because it was quite funny. I was, I think, this day presenting to Centrica in the UK, so to about 500 people. So behind that screen, as in my camera, was 500 people, but behind the camera was a step ladder that had notes sellotaped to a broom, sellotaped to the step ladder, and then on the laptop was balanced onto a garden chair with my jigsaws, raising it up, balanced on a table. The problem with cheap equipment is it's very hot, and it was a very hot day, so everything started to melt, and I managed to get through, and they didn't see any difference, but it was a big challenge for me. Pleased to hear my life is a little bit more like this now. I obviously do a lot of in real life events where I'm permitted with restrictions, but this is a lot simpler, so things are a lot calmer today. So I'm going to have a couple of little interactive bits throughout this, but I'm going to start with two rhetorical questions, or sorry, just one rhetorical question, which is, how would you feel if I was to ask you to go outside and smash your smartphone on the floor? So just really almost have a sense of sitting with that. Maybe you're thinking, do you know what, Chris, already I don't like this presentation because I have a brand new iPhone or I have a brand new Galaxy. And maybe you're thinking, actually, Chris, you know, I'm a little bit tired of my phone. Maybe you feel a little bit like this guy. So the good news is I'm not going to do that. Instead, what I'm going to do is introduce evidence-based behavior change tools and techniques to help you improve your digital resilience and be right to disconnect ready. But the reason I asked you that question was just to remind you of the attachment and the bonds that we have with our digital devices. We love them for the freedom and flexibility that they give us, but sometimes we struggle a little bit for the control that they have over us. So let's just take a little bit of a history lesson and look at how we got here. Let's look at how technology has changed in the last 80 years through the lens of processing power. So 100 quadrillion times, and that's so exciting. It's brought such incredible innovation to our lives and enabled us to do so many things. But we have to remember that us as humans, during that time, physiologically, we haven't really changed. So let's just set the context for today and bring it to something that's way more pertinent, which is our digital devices in our pockets. And this was the late Steve Jobs making this really interesting prediction back in 2007 when the iPhone was first launched. And as Brian mentioned at the beginning, I've always been a massive fan and an early adopter of technology. And I remember seeing this, and as somebody who absolutely loved and still does love technology, I was a little bit skeptical. And yet here we are. We now know that everything we do in some shape or form typically has a relationship with our smartphone. And then obviously in the last 20 months, we've gone through what McKinsey and Company coined as the quickening. We've vaulted 5 years forward in business adoption in just 8 weeks. That was right at the beginning of that first lockdown. And kudos to all the IT departments out there who made it work, because it does work, right? From a technology point of view, it works and it's amazing. However, as humans, this is what many of us have started to feel like. This is what Satya Nadella, the CEO of Microsoft, was quoted as saying in Business Insider towards the end of last year. Working from home feels a little bit like sleeping at work. And if we consider that change that we've gone through, it's really the biggest change we've gone in organizations and the way we work since the Industrial Revolution. And so much of technology, specifically digital technology, has been really positive. If we think of it's helped us cope, me personally, although I'm now a proud Irishman, you know, a lot of my family are overseas, so it's helped me keep in contact with them. It's helped with children's education, so many positives. However, what we've seen over time, repeated again and again in the research, so this is out of the Becker-Friedman Institute and from Harvard, is that overall, across sector, our total hours have increased. And typically what's happened is, in relation to that, in parallel, our productivity hasn't actually changed that much. So cumulatively, what that means is our productivity has actually fallen. And then if we think of the long-term impact of that continuously working around 30% more hours, that leads to emotional exhaustion, which then leads to burnout and has a big impact on employee turnover and is a driver for the Great Resignation. So we're now going through this change, this new working model. We were remote for a long time. We went back to hybrid, and for the majority of us, we've gone back to remote. What guardrails do we have? Well, we're here today to talk to you about the right to disconnect, which is a key guardrail. And for those of you who aren't familiar with it, from a very, very simple point of view, what it does is it encourages the checking of email out of office hours to be the exception rather than the norm. And it was introduced here as a code of practice in April of this year. But just to give you a quick history lesson, this is where else the right to disconnect has actually been put through as legislation. And in most countries, it's actually been put through as law. But in Ireland, it's a code, so it can act as evidence against existing legislation, such as the Organisation and Working Time Act of 1997. Now, what you can see there is a huge trend within the last year, and we can see that potentially that's going to grow even more, because in the last 20 months, our digital demands have increased massively. So this is research from Microsoft, which has shown that voice and video calls have gone up by at least 2 times, and IM traffic gone up by 65%. So in the next year, we expect to see similar legislation coming out of Australia, out of the EU, and out of the UK. In fact, it's quite funny because the Queen mentioned the new employment bill in the Queen's speech last year. So it's something that's very high priority over there. So when it comes to learnings, What I'm going to do here is primarily take the learnings from France, because one of our scientific advisors, Jean-Francois Stitch, has been involved in a lot of companies over there in relation to their policies. So initially in France, very similar to here, it was all about duty of care. And this is what has happened here. A lot of people have worked with the Work Relations Commission in relation to their templates. They have some incredible tools and templates there available, but a lot of companies have kind of just ticked the box in relation to that duty of care. So what happened in France in 2018 was this really moved to risk mitigation. There was a legal case of 60,000 euros, after which organizations, once they saw that, they've put into practice more detailed policies. So not necessarily stricter, but starting to look at the culture, which we'll talk about in the next few slides. And we have to remember that here in 2018, we had a similar case under existing legislation as well. So let's talk about the exciting, happy stuff. So number 3 for me really is looking at the rules of engagement, which create an opportunity to improve our organization effectiveness, because we have a real opportunity here to change our rules of engagement so that we can have improved company performance, reduce staff turnover. So just back to that idea of the Great Resignation, and improving employee well-being. So one example of this is what's called flexible working arrangements. So we've seen lots of examples of these, specifically in the last 20 months, things like Zoom Free Fridays. Prior to that, there were a lot of bigger examples, things like zero email. Certain companies have specific company-based rights disconnects, such as AXA in Spain. And a lot of the German car manufacturers had and still have technology which switches off and switches on at certain times. However, often these are seen as tactical band-aids because there is no one size fits all. And I love this quote from Adam Grant. If more than one person is facing burnout, deep breathing is a band-aid, not a repair. You need to change the structure of the job or the culture of the organization. And just to bring it to what we're talking about today, the same as technology, Zoom Free Friday is a great idea, but it's not as simple as just doing that to reduce digital demands. And if we just put band-aids in without considering the culture, they can have unintended consequences. For example, Valve, which is a multi-billion-dollar US gaming company, they were initially concerned about burnout a couple of years ago, and they looked to introduce an overtime ban, which actually had the technology switching off out of office hours. However, they had a work design with a dynamic mindset. And what they actually did was they consulted with employees, and they found that sometimes overtime was actually necessary. But the key was awareness. So for example, if Brian is working 5 extra hours next week because there's a client deadline, that might be okay. But if he's working 5 extra hours every week, then it's not okay. So let's have a look at culture change through work design. So the structure of what I'm going to be going through here is based on a case study out of Harvard. Leslie Perlow, the business psychologist there, has a wonderful case study which I can share after this talk with the Boston Consulting Group, which focuses on how work design can actually work in this sort of environment. So I'm going to give you an example and just walk through the different steps. So if we take something like a Zoom Free Friday, that's a flexible working arrangement. But if we were to look at that from a work design point of view, we would draw up what potentially might be called a communication charter or a type of team charter where we look at shared values and norms so that it's flexible and it works for everyone and there are no unintended consequences. When we look at who this is implemented and led by, typically FWAs are led by HR. Work design is typically led by the SLT, so it comes down from the top. If we think of who's involved, FWAs are typically everyone in the organization. However, work design typically comes down to teams and units, because that way you can really home in on those shared values and norms. Desired outcomes, FWAs, really positive, helps us with our work-life balance. But building on that, work design looks to improve work processes. And the employee's role within this, in FWAs, participants, but in work design, typically they're involved in the design and the evaluation of these new work designs. Then when it comes to education, so with FWAs, people are told about the launch of them and we know what they are. However, with work design, they go a bit more detail as to the why. And in the case of what we're going to be talking about, it's the likes of digital well-being. So all of those areas from a work design point of view, we've worked with for the last 6 years, and in the last, specifically in this last year with the likes of Takeda, Flutter Entertainment, AIB, and a number of others. But the one area I'm going to focus on today is this piece of education. So we're going to dig into understanding why, and we're going to look at two key areas. The first is that of awareness, and we're then going to move on to friction. So let's start off by looking at our cognitive resources. I'm going to ask you a rhetorical question. It's a really, really simple one. Since the beginning of this talk, how many of you have multitasked? So what I mean by that is cognitively multitasked. How many of you have performed another cognitive task away from this screen, which I'm hoping was your original intention? So it might have been check your email, it might have been check a social media platform. Typically when we do this live, it's anywhere from between 90 to 99%, because this is a habit that we all have, right? It's almost accepted as a norm. However, the majority of you will probably know this. There is no such thing as multitasking. When it comes to physical multitasking, absolutely that works. But from a cognitive point of view, we only have a single processor, so we can't parallel process. There is a very small percentage of people who can cognitively multitask, but what they're doing is they're doing something called task switching very quickly. So I'm going to give you an example as to how this works. Then we're going to have a little quiz just to see whether you are one of those 2%. So this is research from Professor Gloria Mark and her team out of the University of California, Irvine. And what it shows us is that historically, we would have been doing one task, we would have had an interruption, and we would have been able to get pretty much most of our cognitive resources back to that original task in hand. So that was maybe 15, 20 years ago. We now have, all of us, a habit of task switching. So what happens now is we'll be doing task A, we'll get interrupted, and the majority of us will struggle with that because we have what's called attentional blink and attentional residue, which means it takes us up to 23 minutes to get back to the original task in hand. So this is task switching, also known as continuous partial attention. And it's this idea of this is what our brain's doing when we're going back and forth. So although it might feel good because we're secreting dopamine when we do that, it's also exhausting. So just building on this, this is the same team. So Gloria Mark and Mary Sawinski and the team at Irvine University, they looked at a socially controlled experiment in the workplace, looking at how frequently people switched tasks. So just have a think as to what you think that might have been in 2004. That was the same year that Facebook was founded. Again, a rhetorical question. How often do you think we switched tasks work-wise in 2004? It was 3 minutes, 5 seconds, which feels quite comfortable, right? That feels okay. What do you reckon for 2016, which was when TikTok was founded, just as kind of a milestone? Have a think. If it was 3 minutes back then, what would it be in 2016? Exactly the same controlled experiment. 40 seconds. That's quite alarming. And if we think of that trajectory, we're already into negative numbers there. So this is the difference. It's 4 times. Now, obviously, this isn't to scale, but it gives you that idea as to that's how much harder we're having to work. And yet our brain physiologically hasn't changed. So when we look at the impact of this, it really has a major impact on our ability to perform at work, it has an impact on our ability to disconnect, and it has an impact on our ability to have meaningful connections with other humans. So on to the quiz, guys, because some of you will be thinking, hold up, Chris, I've got this. I'm one of those task switchers who can really get this. So I have a little challenge for you. I have a video that I'm going to push play on. It's going to read you 2 different stories. One's going to be read orally, the other's going to be printed on screen. I'm going to come back at the end with some questions, and good luck. So before I go on to the questions, just have a sense of how you feel. And some of you might be thinking that's quite exaggerated, but that was only 2 different stories. Typically at any given time, we will have multiple tabs open on our browser. We'll have different devices. So already that's more than 2. So how are we feeling, guys? Feeling confident? See what you remember, and good luck. So the first question is, what was Rick great at? And you get a bonus point if you can recognize that 80s icon. He was a great mountain leader. What did Ada win awards for? Emotional intelligence. What did Ada put her success down to? Spending quality time with the family at the weekends. So kudos if you got all 3 right. I suggest you maybe look to join one of the superhero, Marvel or DC comic groups, or talk to your boss about how amazing you are at cognitively task switching. But for the majority of us, this is what we were doing. It's hard. Let's just build on this and have a look at the research on the impact of that. So recent research out of the University of London shows that when we continuously task switch, has twice the negative impact on our IQ versus smoking marijuana. And this is why we often get to the end of a workday and we feel like we've got a lot done, but we haven't actually worked effectively. So let's just have a review now as to how this might impact our time. How do you spend your time if we're looking at an average working day? Are you able to actually put all these things into different areas and have a really strong focus and potentially achieve states like flow and deep work? Chances are, if you have the habit of task switching, it's unlikely. So let's just have a look at how this works. And all of these are scholarly numbers. So on average, we get 150 emails a day, 70% of which are read within 6 seconds. And then it takes us between 70 seconds and 23 minutes to return to that original task in hand. Let's just take below average numbers here. So let's say we get 100 emails a day, 70% of which are read within 6 seconds, and it takes us 70 seconds. So I'm going really low end here to return to that original task in hand. That's 81 minutes a day. That's 20% of our working time checking emails and recovering. And that's just email. That's not considering all the other platforms. So that's understanding how technology is impacting our cognitive resources. Part of that, why? What's the impact? The second part I'm going to look at just for today is that of psychological detachment. So this is primarily research out of the University of Mannheim. It's Sabine Sonnentag and her team. And quite simply, it's a state in which we mentally disconnect from work and do not think about other job-related issues. The impact of this, when we get it right, when we are able to detach, productivity goes up, we're more engaged, and we are more convivial with our colleagues. So historically, when we worked in offices, this was relatively easy for our brain to find those little lines and create psychological detachment. We had all these, what might be called rituals or ceremonies. We dressed from work, we commuted, we had a different work location. We would switch off the work computer, we would commute and we'd come home and we'd potentially change clothes. Whereas this is what happens now. It's almost as if we're wearing 2 pairs of shoes at any given time. So we need to look to do things like create rituals. So a very simple example is what's called liminal moments. These are all these little points of compression that we used to get to decompress, such as water cooler moments. So if we think of historically when we were in the office, we may well have had back-to-back meetings, but chances are, even if we had a back-to-back meeting in the same meeting room, we would have still had a 30-second in between where I said, "Hey, Brian, how are you? Looking forward to Christmas," and just had that lovely decompression. That's a liminal moment. We very rarely get that now when it comes to having breaks. And then think of just how we can actually create psychological detachment for our mind by little signs and signifiers. So a really simple one is to actually change our clothes when we're working. And if you wanted to add on to that, if you have children, obviously try to make it fun. This lady has here with lovely slippers. But if you think of it from an external point of view, when your children see that you're putting on work clothes, over time, they can identify that with, this is mummy's focus time. And when you take it off, it's fun time. That doesn't mean your children will stop annoying you and asking you for food when you're on a Zoom call, but over time, it will help. And then the third thing when it comes to rituals is finding time to actually almost have a ceremony of just closing that laptop down. And there's lots of research showing how effective this is in relation to helping us manage stress. So creating these liminal moments is a really good example here. This is recent research from Microsoft based on people who are using Teams and people who don't have breaks. As you can see in that top right there, there's high levels of stress, and people who do have micro breaks, so maybe 2 minutes every 30 minutes or every 25 minutes, far less stress. So over time, rewiring the brain, reducing that need to task switch, reducing the expectation of dopamine, enabling us to psychologically detach, getting better rest, and then over time leading to higher performing and happier staff. So that was an understanding and almost a little bit of education as to the why do we need to look at work design around the right to disconnect. I'm going to give you a few little tips around friction. So there are hundreds of tools and techniques, and when we go into masterclasses, we go into a lot of detail with them, but I'm just going to give you my favorite behavior nudge, essentially. And this is based around a study which has been replicated lots of times. It's called the iPhone effect. And what it shows us is that if we have a digital device within our line of sight, even if it's switched off and turned over, it will negatively impact our IQ and our empathy. So to give you a really simple example here, if we're on a video call, so if we think of that screen over on the left, it might be the most engaging call we've ever been on. We might be having the most fun. But if we have our digital devices around us and we have a habit of task switching, typically our brain is going to be expecting TikTok, email, the news, or whatever it might be. So how can we manage that? So there's a lot of companies that prior to lockdown had fantastic policies around this. So for example, Twitter, Warner Music, and eBay all had 0 device policies for senior management meetings prior to lockdown. And a lot of that has actually translated into the world of video calls, and that for certain meetings, not for all meetings, they encourage just one device, because we need to have the one device in order to make the call. But I love this quote from Sinead McSweeney, who's MD of Twitter Ireland, in that she wasn't just looking at decision-making, almost the effectiveness of the meeting, but that lovely respect and empathy, which we know sometimes we struggle with when we have a call with somebody and they're looking down at their phone. So let's just have a think as to where else this impacts us in our life. Video calls is a really good example. Which other devices do I have open? Maybe when I'm having family time, which devices do I have at the table? And then when I'm in the bedroom, which is a really important place for rest and intimacy. And then just think about the impacts of task switching and psychological detachment that's encouraging. So as Christmas is coming up, I have a little challenge for you guys. It's a lovely challenge. So we work with the not-for-profit, the Unconnected, which is a wonderful organization that is all about digital equality. So their whole purpose is to get as many people as they can in developing countries connected to the internet. Interestingly, working with us, we help them with the ethics of that. But one of the lovely challenges that they have is called Unconnect 24. So I would encourage you over the festive period to maybe challenge this and use this challenge with your family or with your teammates. Quite simply, all you do is you go to the unconnected.org, you go to Unconnect 24, and there's fundraising details there, and you simply get your friends to sponsor you. It doesn't have to be for 24 hours, it can be Unconnect 2 or Unconnect 4, but get your friends to sponsor you for actually taking time away from technology so that you're starting just to rewire the brain away from those task switching and enabling easier psychological detachment. So that was a very, very quick spin of where we're at with the right to disconnect and just some of the key educational pieces around awareness or cognitive resources, psychological detachment, and a little bit as to how we can create friction. It's really for us just the tip of the iceberg. We go into a lot more detail on our masterclasses around digital wellbeing, work design, and digital culture. But now for me, my favorite part of these, I'd like to open the floor to questions. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I look forward to hearing from you guys.
Chris, well, thanks a million for that. That was, I've taken quite a few notes there. I'll have to go back over this and watch that again. I mean, start with, first of all, I know we're talking about like the code of practice on the right to disconnect mostly, but I don't know if the Health and Safety at Work Act could have been called into question there for your own initial work setup, but I'm glad to see you've updated the your setup there at the moment. I love the work design approach, the idea of approaching from a work design perspective. That kind of echoes with what I'm trying to promote with ISO 45003 and psychological well-being in the workplace. The idea of how work is organized, looking at that first, as opposed to just the individual piece.
Yeah.
And the multitasking. It's like you just had a look inside my brain there to see what was going on, and the cognitive multitasking that I kind of can't get away from. And a terrible example is, it's not even when I'm working. Let's say if I'm trying to relax and watch a movie on Netflix, but I have the phone out and I say, oh, something pops into my mind, and I say, well, I'll multitask here. I'll get some kind of work or research done or whatever it might be, or send a quick message. Yeah. And then 10 minutes later, I realize I have no idea what's just happened in the movie. That kind of idea, but that's the task switching that you mentioned. I think that's a real That's a real challenge, isn't it? And
Yeah.
the 2004 versus 2016, that makes a lot of sense. If I feel like I had really good concentration levels back then, but they have been slowly ebbing away over the last number of years. And I think Suzanne, AIB, she was just commenting something similar. She's the multiple things that's going on there consistently.
Yeah.
Is it working on the friction, reducing the friction? Is that how we kind of try and solve that issue?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing you alluded to there was almost, just seeing how it relates to you, and even just doing that test, because I think we have to remember that our brain tricks us to make it feel like we're doing more. Because quite often when we multitask, so for example, if you're watching a movie and you're checking your email, typically you're going to secrete something nice like dopamine, because every new bit of information you get, that's what you're rewarded with, which feels amazing. Historically, that was great. It was basically saving us from a saber-toothed tiger, because that new bit of information was going to save our lives. Whereas now we struggle to actually manage that capacity and that demand. So that first bit is the awareness of, okay, I am doing this. And then it's finding, how can I put friction in place? So the iPhone effect is a study that kind of, for me, gives you a really nice benchmark of, let's just see what else do I have open here? And then what friction can I put into place? And this is something that, for us, it's very similar to that idea of something tactical versus work design. For a lot of us, we want to jump ahead with a solution and kind of have the top 10 solutions, but you need to find what works for you. Now, one thing I will say when it comes to, let's say, the big solutions out there, I don't like to give a silver bullet, and I don't think there's one solution that fits all. But one thing that I'm finding is very common, and it's a really simple one, some of you might have come across this already, is we spend a lot of our time sleeping. So that's a really simple area for us to actually look at where technology is impacting us. So trying to reduce the amount of screens in the bedroom is a big thing. It can have a huge impact. But when we're doing that, we have to remember how our brain works when it comes to habits. Because if we just get rid of the screens, our brain's going to be like, well, I liked that. That was nice. I had audiobooks. I had my family WhatsApp group, all the good things. So we have to be kind to our brain. First of all, do it in slow doses. Then if we are going to remove it, get something nice as a replacement. So, get one of those lights that comes up. I think we actually have this on special this week, which is the sunrise light, or, a vibrating watch, which is what I have, or voice assist that doesn't have a screen. But it's remembering that habits are complicated. We can't just assume I'm just going to get a travel alarm clock, it'll be fine. Because our brain, after a week or so, would just be like, do you know what, Brian? I miss my phone. It was nice to me. So, yeah.
So small, again, like exercise, like nutrition, small steps initially, and kind of hope and build up over time. Then see what works for you, the individual.
Yeah.
Any insights on how are we doing? Actually, we're 6 months in now to the code of practice is in place. Are you hearing anything from any of the organizations you're working with? How are they kind of approaching the right to disconnect? Is it in terms of policy? Is this kind of team-based decisions, or what are you seeing?
Yeah, so I think, the one thing I would say, most stepping back from just the right to disconnect, is it's been such a challenging time for HR and decision makers around people. So, it was just another thing to add on to already a massively complex and changing environment. And even, we know in the last couple of months, things have changed again. We've had to go back to, majority of us working from home. So it's almost as if there are other things which have been, rightly so, more important. But what we have seen is a lot of organizations are moving away from just that duty of care to start to look at not necessarily the risk mitigation, but for us, the work design piece. So we've done a lot of work recently with the likes of Flutter Entertainment and Takeda, the pharmaceutical, around that piece of actually working with teams to, first of all, have their understanding of what digital wellbeing is. So going far deeper in relation to the idea of task switching and the idea of psychological detachment and all the other various things in relation to how the technology, actually the mechanics of that, pulls us in. And then moving on to look at things like team charters and communications charters. So an example of that would be, I can share with you, I'm not sure how you would send that out, maybe in the newsletter, Brian, the example of the Harvard Business School working with Boston Consulting Group. But to give you a really simple example of how a communications charter might work, if you have a team, the chances are you've never sat down and actually discussed which different tools you use for different things. So as a result of that, what happens is every night or every weekend, you probably check all the different platforms. So even just having an SLA, so a service level agreement, within your team around the shared values and norms as to which is our priority platform. So at the weekend, I don't need to be checking Teams. I don't need to be checking Trello. I don't need to be checking WhatsApp. I'm just going to check text. And maybe that's not right for everyone, but they need to have that discussion. So that's the communications charter. But then it has to come into combination with the education piece, with it being led by the leaders, and then making sure that it's evaluated and there are no unintended consequences. So, but it's very new. It's very new. For us, it's something that we've been working in this space for 6 years, but that digital culture piece and specifically work design has only really become a priority in the last year and a half.
I'd imagine it's like any kind of major intervention or policy or culture building. If it's coming from the top, it's going to be listened to. It's going to be adhered to a lot more. And a great example, Sinead McSweeney, I've seen you give that before. It's an excellent example. And Carl was kind of touching on this with in schools, kind of the phone away box, this kind of idea. But that's something maybe simple an organization could do. But I love the Twitter idea of just the meetings are no phone zones or no laptop zones if you're not presenting. But again, coming from the top or potentially at a team level, that's a decision the team could make. And by the way, if anyone has a question for Chris, just pop it in the chat or in the comment section there.
And just
I'm not sure if you want to come in there. I've got an interesting question for you here, but did you want to come in there on something?
Yeah, just a really quick one. Thanks, Brian. So just in relation to having, no device policies, do remember that doesn't work for, there's the unintended consequences. If we have no devices for all team meetings, then that might not work. So even having a charter around different kinds of meetings, some of them, and back to if we think of Zoom fatigue, so some of them might just be audio calls where we can actually have less of a cognitive load because it's just through the, through the voice. Some of them you can have as many devices as you want open, but others, so say if it's a one-to-one, typically when we're doing team charters, one-to-one, you'd only have one device open, which would be me talking to you, Brian. But if it was an AGM or an all hands, then typically, you can have other devices open because you might need to check other devices for content. So sorry, the question.
No, but I realize I'm a terrible example of this at the moment myself. I have quite a few screens open trying to manage everything here as well. But I do not use me as an example for this particular session. Yeah, great point though. So here's an interesting question. Let's see if it all fits on the screen now. From coming in from LinkedIn, the disbelief from the peers really. I'm not sure, can you see that there, Chris? If you do have your own kind of certain policy, I've seen Tim Ferriss speak about this years ago, saying he only checks his email maybe once a day or twice a day at certain times. But what if your peers then in the company, I guess they need you to be on the ball kind of thing?
Yeah, and this is this habit of reciprocity, right? So if we think of where task switching has come from, it's come from so many different things, but a lot of it's come from media. Even if we look at, this is going to seem like a weird analogy, but stick with me, movies. Historically, I think something like in the 70s, an average change of scene, so every time you change scene, was something like 40, 50 seconds. And now it's down in the single digits, right? So it's that whole thing. All of these different things are encouraging that habit of constant changing, which gives our brain a habit of constant expectation. We have the same thing as the LinkedIn user there is saying, in relation to, okay, I get an email saying, but I just sent this, where's the answer? It's not like that person's wrong. It's just we've kind of evolved to have this habit. So back to that idea of sitting down and having shared values and norms. If there is an expectation for an email that needs to be responded within 3 minutes, then we need to know why. Can that be, okay, we'll mark that as priority, and that means it will get through certain filters, and I might see a pop-up box if that comes. Otherwise, having a chat with the team saying, typically I will respond to emails unless they're marked as priority within 2 hours. Otherwise, what all of us are doing are checking every single platform, and we're exacerbating this issue of task switching, or making it far harder for us to detach at the end of the working day. Because even then, if we think of the most simple version of psychological detachment, which is sleep, we won't be able to switch off because our brain is still switching. So it is something ideally you need to sit down with your team and talk about. But again, that difference between flexible work arrangements and work design, you need to talk to them about digital well-being and the impact to them, and actually show them the why, why this is important, why it's going to impact our ability to perform as an organization, why it's going to impact your ability to have good human relationships, Because otherwise people are just like, but I need that, because this is a habit that we all have.
And at the end of that question, it didn't come through, but there's a line that says, and you have a flabbergasted boss who just assumes you're up to date with all the updates all the time. So that's, I mean, that's clear. I think there's a communications charter, as you say, kind of needed there. There's something, needed there at a team or an organizational level just to nail that down. Yeah.
And just, I mean, a funny aside on that, Brian, I'm currently on a dating app, right? If we think this is a habit that's just in the workplace, I'm on a dating app, and a girl messaged me last week. We're having a lovely chat, and I just had a particularly busy day and I didn't message her. And I got a message from her the next day saying, I haven't heard from you for 12 hours, so I assume you're not interested. And then she deleted me. Just like, but where has this come from? We're having a lovely conversation.
You didn't have your communications charter clearly highlighted.
No, exactly. I mean, it's very clear on my profile, that we need to have that chat. But it's that whole thing of, it creeps into all different parts of life. We have this expectation then with, maybe older relatives, possibly not that extreme, but it's everywhere. So we do need to just talk about it.
Yeah, this expectation that we're going to be replying instantly to communications.
Yeah.
How you touched on it in your presentation. Any more thoughts on how are we doing compared to what's going on elsewhere in other jurisdictions? And so I think France was a good example there. It was in 2017. They actually brought in legislation. How are they doing there or in other jurisdictions? Is it possible to compare what we're doing here with what's happening in France at the moment? Or can we learn anything because they're a little bit ahead of us?
Yeah, I mean, we have to remember that the actual country culture comes into play quite a lot as well. So France typically has a very different culture when it comes to work-life balance. Even before the rights disconnecting, it was probably one of the reasons that it was driven through there so early. When it comes to them leaving the office, not for everybody, but way more than here in the UK and in the US. That's it. Work is done, right? It's then sitting down, having dinner, having a nice social experience. Whereas for people in the UK, people in Ireland and the US, it's more of a similar culture there where the boundaries, even prior to COVID, were far more blurred. So I think it's quite hard to compare like for like. I mean, the one thing I would say, and one thing I was really happy about, because we were actually one of the organizations that were consulted in the development of the legislation here, is that it's a code and it's not a legislation, because there is no one size fits all. And what the code enables us to do is raise awareness on the subject, but then actually go, right, guys, let's look at the upside of this. Let's not just see this as a bit more extra work. Let's see how we can become a more effective organization through work design. So I'm delighted that that's happened here. I'd be interested to see what happens next year with the EU as to whether that'll be a slightly tighter version on top of what we've got. From a legal point of view, I'm not quite sure how that would work. But I think the key thing is, in the last year and a half, we've seen all these new legislations. I'd say there'll be at least another 5 countries next year. And it gets people talking about this subject because we need to.
Yeah. So it gets to move. We're moving in the right direction, certainly. I'm yet to see kind of maybe practical examples of this in the workplace. I actually asked you this question when you came on the podcast, but that was a little over a year ago. I just wonder if you've had any more insight since. And it was kind of around let's say there's 2 people within an organization and they're going for the same position, the same promotion. And one of them is following the right to disconnect to the letter of the law, and they're going home, they're switching off, they're getting their work done, a really good worker. Then the other person of their own free will is happy to reply to emails out of hours, this kind of idea. The decision then comes down to the hiring manager still. I mean, who gets that promotion? Is there code of practice, legislation? I mean, that's not really covered there, is it? It's still coming down to that human decision.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really hard one. It's very much based on not just the culture of the organization, but that individual and their drive. I'm going to flip that question slightly by looking at it through a different lens, through the lens of, let's look at it as the issue we have in many organizations now around the Great Resignation and such high employee turnover. So one of our lead actual scholarly advisor is Professor Monadi Patarafta. So she was the key scholar who defined technostress. She was a key contributor to the recent Economist paper on the future of work and digital well-being. And she teaches a number of different courses. One which is an MBA in Massachusetts. And she's repeatedly said to me that when she's working with her graduates who are looking at the job market, the number one thing they're now looking at is around the structure of something like a right to disconnect. So for her, it's in the US, so it's not called the right to disconnect. They're going to organizations and they're saying, I'm a really smart person, I want to work for you, but what is your strategy in relation to how hybrid impacts my digital behavior? So, what do you have? Do you have communication charters? What rules of engagement do you have around this? And I think it's really important that we look at this not only to attract people, but to keep them as well. So that's, for me, a big change, as opposed to just being duty of care. It's like, guys, we can really retain our staff here and get more, effective working, and, in the long term, obviously improve their well-being as well.
It's a good point. There's HR departments have a lot going on at present, don't they? Kind of trying to manage the hybrid working, what that will look like. I had Joe O'Connor on the podcast recently talking about the 4-day week movement as well. How does the right to disconnect fit in with these kind of different working or changing working models? Is simply back to that communication charter or communication policy, regardless of what kind of working model you have?
Yeah, and that's the whole, again, the difference, I guess, between flexible working arrangements and work design. It's the idea of remembering we all have different cultures within the organization, but then it really needs to come down to a team level. And I think with all these different things, whether it's 4-day working week or the right to disconnect, it's looking at it from a team and project point of view and then building on that. So just to go back to the Boston Consulting Group, that was something that Leslie did with one team, first of all. And the idea for them was, she kind of took an extreme example. Management consultants, they're known as always on, they're very, very high performers.
Well, I'm a recovering management consultant.
Yeah, me too, actually. Actually, very, very recovering. It was a long, long time ago. So she took them as a challenge, I guess, and she was successful. But at first, what they did was, when they presented the case, was the challenge they had was, it wasn't that they wanted to actually have almost like the right to disconnect. It was more extreme than that. They just wanted one night off a week, right? Because they were 24/7 and they just wanted one night off a week. So this is a really extreme case. And what she did was, again, they sat down as a team and they worked out, okay, so Brian, you can have Monday off, Chris, you can have Tuesday off. And what that meant was, Brian knew on a Monday that if there was a fire, someone would contact him. But for anything else, he didn't need to check, because everything had been delegated, everything had been managed. The most important thing to them was that their clients would still be responded to super, super quickly. And as a result of that, this was rolled out globally with the Boston Consulting Group. It was mentioned for 3 years in a row in their annual report. And it was seen to be one of the key points in actually retaining their staff. So yeah, I think that's a really good example, but it has to come down to the idea of, and I'm glad you mentioned Joe, because I met Joe just before Christmas in my local park, both walking our dogs. I know he's in New York now, but yeah, lovely guy. And so, it's that whole thing of whether it's a 4-day working week or right to disconnect, we need to look at it as far as how it works in a team, first of all, because otherwise, if we're just putting it across without thinking of the unintended consequences, everybody has different ways of working. Every team, every project has different ways of working. And I know that adds complexity, but hybrid is incredibly complicated, and we need to take a step back and actually look at it from a values and norms point of view. The easiest way to do that is by breaking it down into small digestible chunks, just like you said earlier, that idea of tiny habits, the BJ Fogg concept. And looking at it, this is a digestible chunk. Let's look at one project and team, let's get it working here, and then these can be the ambassadors for the rest of the organization. And that's what I'm doing with the likes of Takeda and Flutter. They've chosen specific teams. We're seeing it as a role model internally. It's working really well. And they're then becoming ambassadors and doing internal videos saying, guys, this is working. We're going to do it in another team. And gradually, they start to see those benefits wider and wider.
Very good. Yeah, we can include that link. I'll send a link out to everyone who's registered, and we can include that study. But that brings me back now. It was it feels like it was a different time in the management consulting days. But I do remember my old manager half jokingly, when it was a quiet time, he would kind of say, take Sunday off. It was that kind of environment back then. It was a different time. But certainly, I can kind of relate to that and why it was mentioned in the annual reports. Listen, any final questions on the right to disconnect for Chris? Pop them in the chat now. Chris, it's coming up to the festive period. How does one of the co-founder of Unplugs, how does one, I don't know, is it kind of wind down or manage your technology over the festive period? Is there anything we can learn from yourself?
I think the phrase you used there, Brian, wind down, is really important, because quite often what happens, it's almost like when we're working really hard and we go on holiday and we sometimes get sick because our body's just gone into shock because all of a sudden we've stopped. If we're used to being in back-to-back Zoom meetings and all of a sudden we're sat on a couch watching Netflix, try to maybe the last couple of days reduce your digital consumption from a work point of view. So have that balance, because otherwise, not that your body's going to go into shock, but those habits, micro habits become macro habits and they're far harder to change. So do a slow change. As I said, for me in December, typically we reduce the amount of work we're doing delivery-wise, which means I can spend a lot less time on screens. That means when I fly back and see my mum, my brain is less in the habit of task switching. I will obviously be consuming, I'm sure, lots of Netflix and possibly checking my phone at the same time. But typically, because we're human, right? We all do this stuff once in a while. But even when I'm with her, I have very clear boundaries, not for her, because she doesn't really like tech. But, I know when I'm in the room with her, I'm like, okay, I'm just going to watch the movie. I'm not going to have my phone here because I'm only with her, a certain amount of time. And if I'm spending that time and my intention is checking a dating app, which, in the long run, she might actually like that because she gets to wear a hat. But, it's that whole thing of having an awareness, is this the right thing to be doing right now?
Very good, yeah. And there's a question from D there, just to say, D, yes, you can watch the recording back. Definitely, if you even missed the start, absolutely go back and watch the start. There was an excellent presentation from Chris at the beginning, and I'll include that in the email that'll go out to everyone that registered. Here's almost kind of a selfish one, Chris, but I think something you will be able to relate to as a small business owner. I think a lot of the workplace well-being, the health, workplace promotion stuff that I do, I think a lot of the work that you do as well, you're talking to organizations, you're talking to fairly large organizations, teams of people at least. Mm-hmm. For the individual, maybe the business, the self-employed or the small business owner, is there anything extra, a different approach perhaps to kind of managing our technology? Because one thing I do struggle with is just taking the time off. Is literally switching off. Because even though I know I'm actually looking forward to the time over the festive period for family, with friends, if possible. And I will not maybe be online and sending lots of emails and that kind of thing, but I will have the notepad there and the pen and paper and planning for 2022. That's always there. I think if you're a business owner. And any thoughts on that one and stopping that hamster wheel maybe?
Yeah, and it's a really good point, Brian, because not a kind of woe is me, but running a small business, as you well know, it's hard. There's a lot going on. So that idea of psychological detachment is really tough. And like you, I work in lots of different time zones. So I teach in the US at Digital Wellness Institute. We have weekly check-ins with the students, which is, right before Christmas. That's very long. I've got a couple of calls in West US time tonight, but we have to do this at certain times just to keep the business going and keep our research going. But on that, I think what's most important to me is when we are taking time away from technology to do what we would call resilience deposits. And these are, I'm sure you've probably covered these off in other podcasts, around evidence-based practices that help us recharge the best. So the really simple ones are doing things like spending time in nature, having time with humans in real life. And I know they're common sense, but it's that whole thing of making sure when I'm taking time away from my work, I'm not just checking TikTok all the time. In small doses, that's fine, right? Mm-hmm. But if we're doing that all the time, we're back to those habits. And we know it might not be the nicest thing to do on a cold, wet day, but once we're out with our friends and our families down the beach or in the park, it feels amazing, right? Mm-hmm. And the science shows us that that's how we reset the best. We connect, we slow down. After 3 days, there's the 3-day effect. When we're in nature for 3 days, everything starts to slow down. So the closer we can get to that, the better. And I don't mean you have to run off and, be barefoot running through the woods chanting, which I must admit I quite like doing. You've got to find what's right for you. But just finding those little micro moments of resilience deposits really works.
Sounds great. Yeah, no, I definitely plan on getting outdoors as much as possible in over the festive period. It's usually like today, for example, is an absolutely beautiful, a stunning day, and I'm
Yep.
looking forward to getting outside a little bit later. And there will be time, of course, for the pen and paper, I'm sure. But I should have mentioned I'll be using my unplug, my very fancy unplug notebook to take those notes. So thank you for that, Chris. Did you want to give a mention to the right to disconnect? That's kind of the assessment you've set up.
Sure, yeah. So we partner with the amazing remote first consultancy, Row Remote, and we have a specific assessment for the right to disconnect. So if you go to the number 2 disconnect.com, there's an assessment tool that we have there in relation to being right to disconnect ready. If you're looking at kind of the wider digital wellbeing, digital culture piece, then please go to unplughq.com. Yeah.
So Chris, listen, you've been so generous with your time. What are your plans for Christmas? You're heading over to spend some time in the UK, is it?
I wasn't told it was a hat party, Brian.
Well, it's just to wrap things up. It's our final Workwell webinar of the year. I thought I would have one on standby, just to wrap things up. This won't look great now when people are watching this back in May of 2022, but what can you do?
So I am heading back next week. I have so I sing in Gardner Street Gospel Choir, and although we don't have any big Christmas performances, we are doing a rehearsal tonight, which is specifically Christmas carols. So I'm super excited about that. I mean, we will be singing with masks, social distancing, but that for me, whenever I hear Christmas carols, especially when I'm part of a choir that's singing them, it's magic. So I'm really excited about that. What about yourself?
Yeah, we'll be spending time at home for Christmas. My parents will be coming up to us here in Dublin, and hopefully we're going to get down to Killarney then for the new year. So I love Killarney, the national park. Plenty of opportunities to get outdoors there, hopefully as well. So really looking forward to that.
Cool.
So Chris, listen, thanks again for your time. Merry Christmas to you and yours. And a big thank you to all the Workwell community, our audience who've been with us throughout the year. I will be sending on all the links we mentioned in this episode to everyone that registered. If you didn't register, drop me a line. I can get you the details. Listen, Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year to everyone. We'll be in touch in 2022. Chris, all the best and thank you again.
Thank you, Brian. Merry Christmas to everyone. Cheers.